Empires don't collapse slowly. They don't fade away over decades with polite warnings and gradual decline. They collapse in a single moment, a moment so sudden, so undeniable, that the entire world instantly realizes the game is over. And for the United States, that exact moment has already been set in motion. It hasn't happened yet, but when it does, it will look eerily familiar, because we've seen this exact collapse before. 1. The blueprint. 1956. In 1956, the world witnessed something that should have been impossible. The British Empire, the most powerful empire in modern history, was brought to its knees, not by war, not by invasion, but by a single financial threat. During the Suez Crisis, Britain believed it still controlled the global order. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain responded the only way it knew how, with force. They launched a coordinated invasion alongside France and Israel. Militarily, it was a complete success. British troops dominated the battlefield. They secured the canal. From a traditional perspective, they won. But none of that mattered, because while Britain controlled the battlefield, it no longer controlled the system. And that's when the United States made its move. 2. The invisible weapon. President Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't send troops. He didn't fire a single shot. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into the core of the global financial system and pulled a single lever. The United States threatened to dump massive amounts of British currency onto the global market. At the same time, they blocked Britain from accessing emergency funding through international institutions. And just like that, Britain was trapped. If the US followed through, the British pound would collapse within hours. The country would go bankrupt. No imports, no energy, no survival. So despite winning the war, Britain had no choice. They retreated, completely, unconditionally. That moment didn't just end a military campaign, it ended an empire. Because the world realized something terrifying. Military power means nothing if you don't control the financial system. 3. The new empire. After 1956, the center of global power shifted. It was no longer in London. It was in Washington, inside the U.S. Treasury, inside the Federal Reserve. That's where the real empire lived. And for decades, the United States used that power flawlessly. The dollar became the foundation of global trade. Every country needed it. Every system depended on it. And with that, America gained something far more powerful than military dominance. It gained control over the rules of the entire global economy. 4. The illusion of invincibility. For years, the system worked perfectly. The U.S. could sanction nations, cut them off from global finance, freeze assets, and the world had no choice but to comply. Because the dollar wasn't just a currency, it was the system itself. And when you control the system, you believe you're untouchable. But that belief is exactly what destroys every empire, because it blinds you to the moment when the system begins to change. 5. The fatal mistake. That moment came quietly, almost unnoticed. When the United States and its allies froze hundreds of billions in sovereign reserves belonging to Russia, they believed they were demonstrating ultimate power, a financial nuclear weapon. But the rest of the world saw something very different. They saw a warning, a terrifying realization. If the dollar can be used as a weapon, then no one is safe inside the system. And in that moment, trust began to break. 6. The silent rebellion. What happened next didn't make headlines. There were no dramatic announcements, no declarations of rebellion, just quiet, calculated moves. The nations of the BRICS alliance began building something new, a parallel system, alternative payment networks, bilateral trade agreements in local currencies, digital financial infrastructure outside Western control. They weren't protesting the system. They were replacing it, piece by piece. 7. The real shift at the same time, something even more important was happening. Central banks across the world began accumulating gold, massively, relentlessly. They weren't just diversifying reserves. They were preparing for a world where trust in the dollar no longer exists, because gold doesn't rely on permission. It doesn't depend on politics. It can't be frozen, sanctioned, or erased. And as this shift accelerated, another silent change began. Countries started reducing their holdings of U.S. debt, slowly at first, then faster. Because why would you finance a system that can be used against you? 8. The collapse mechanism. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening. Empires don't collapse because of a single event. They collapse because the system underneath them empties out. The dollar's power comes from global demand. The world needs dollars to function. But what happens when the world stops needing them? That's the real threat. Not war, not politics, but irrelevance. 9. The exact moment, and now we arrive at the moment that changes everything. It hasn't happened yet, but when it does, you'll recognize it instantly. Imagine a geopolitical crisis. The United States responds the way it always has. It issues a financial threat. Cut them off from the dollar system. Sanctions. Isolation, pressure. But this time, something different happens. Nothing. The targeted nations don't collapse. They don't comply. They simply reroute their trade through systems that no longer rely on the dollar. And in that moment, the illusion shatters. Just like Britain in 1956, America realizes its greatest weapon no longer works. 10. The aftermath, and that's when the real consequences begin. For decades, the United States exported its inflation to the rest of the world. Other countries absorbed the cost because they needed dollars. But when that demand disappears, those dollars come back home. All of them, trillions, flooding back into the U.S. economy. And when that happens, inflation doesn't rise, it explodes. The cost of living surges. The middle class gets crushed. Savings lose value. And the system that once sustained the empire turns against it. Final warning, this isn't speculation. It's not theory, it's a pattern we've already seen before. Empires rise on financial dominance, and they fall the moment that dominance is questioned. The United States is not immune to history. It's following it, step by step. The exact same mistake, the exact same arrogance, the exact same blind spot. And when the moment comes, there will be no warning, no gradual decline. Just a single realization, shared by the entire world at once. The system has changed, and the empire is already over.